Hi and welcome to you all. We are so happy to be able to share with you the findings in Kvinna till Kvinna's latest report, Solidarity is Our Only Weapon, and it's all about the situation for women human rights defenders in the world, especially when it comes to security. My name is Eva Silén and I work for Kvinna till Kvinna, and I will be your facilitator today. We have a very full agenda with a great panel that will discuss the topic from many angles. And I will say already now, as we only have 1 hour, we do not think we will have that much time for questions, but maybe we will. We will see in the end. Hopefully you will get a lot out of it anyway. Just want to start with presenting the panel, and the panel is Sofia Cal Thorpe, who is working for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs here in Sweden. She is the ambassador for gender equality and for the feminist foreign policy. We have Ursula Tooth, who is working for the Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, and specifically for the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Irena Svetkovic from Coalition Margins in North Macedonia, and Honada Al-Hariri, who is a Syrian women human rights defender. And I want to say that both Irena and Honada was 2 of the women who gave time to give interviews for the report. So we are very grateful for that. And then we have Petra Tutteman Andorf, who is the Secretary General of Kvinna till Kvinna. That is the panel. And Kvinna till Kvinna have, during the last decade or so, done reporting where we asked women human rights defenders globally about the security situation in different ways. We do this to see if anything changed, if there are new trends. And this is the last one, or the latest one, because we plan to do more, and actually to have it as a biannual report to see the trends and how they are changing. And the report is built both on the knowledge of almost 30 years of working with women human rights defenders in conflict-affected regions, as well as a survey that was answered by 334 women human rights defenders and female journalists from 74 countries. So it is quite global. But we also, as I've already mentioned, have had some in-depth interviews with around 15 women human rights defenders from different regions. So with this little short start, I would like to turn to you, Petra, and I would like to just hear from you. When you read this report, what stood out? What was it that you were thinking of when you had read it?
Thank you very much, Eva. Well, as you said, we've been doing these studies now for for a decade, looking into the state of women human rights defenders and their security situation. And first of all, what we could see is that the hatred and the threats are steadily have increased during this decade. So of course, that's something that stands out. And also, I thought it was really interesting that the work against corruption is the number 1 thing that generates hate today. And 10 years ago, when we started measuring this, was the fight for gender equality and the work against violence against women. That was the number 1. And I think that's really interesting. And what's going on here? Are women human rights defenders working more on this topic, or are they becoming more successful? So that's really interesting. And then what we also could see in the study is that women's rights activists actively choose not to take these threats into consideration because they think that their work is so important and it needs to be done. And I think somewhere in the report is that if not now, then when? If not us, then who? They really see that they need to do this. And then finally, at the same time as they are ignoring the threats or working around them, it's also silencing them. It's very clear in this study that they are much more aware of what they say and how they're communicating. And that, of course, have effects for human rights and for democracy and for the development of peaceful societies.
Yeah, I think all of that is really important. But if we go into sort of the core findings, you have already mentioned that corruption was the number one issue that was said to spark hatred. What other issues were there? And also, what kind of threats did they say it was that they met?
Yeah, well, like I said then, so really challenging power and anti-corruption. And then in following, it's the LGBTQ rights, working for women's rights and broader, and then combating traditional values, working against the gender rhetoric, and in parts in different regions, as you said already, Eva, this is a really global study, but we could see in some regions where there has been violent conflict and war pretty recently, working for peace building and anti-militarism was also something that was really dangerous and caused a lot of threats. And this whole being an enemy of the state or being a foreign agent and talking to the other side, being a traitor, that's really high risk involved in that. And when it comes to what kind of threats, well, all kinds of threats. We could see that 40% of the participants in this survey, just in general, harassment, that 40% have been exposed to that. And then on second place, 32%, so 1/3 of them have been exposed to smear campaigns and false accusations. So quite common. And almost 1 in 4, 23%, have received threats of physical violence, and 19%, which is a really high number, have received death threats. And then we have 1 in 10 experience sexual harassment or sexual abuse due to their activism, and 16% have been stalked. So all in all, I mean, these numbers are awful. They're horrible. And the kind of threats that they received are very often linked to their bodies, targeting women and their honor and targeting their family. And I think a big aim is to spread rumors about women human rights defenders so that they will lose support from their community, from their family, and from their peers. And, so there's this broad range of everything from, false accusations, but also really horrible, the spread of sex tapes and photoshopped pictures and everything.
And it always comes back to women's bodies and what is perceived as the honor, which is quite tiring. But who is behind them?
Well, I would say that's a pretty broad range as well. There are a lot of actors working against women human rights defenders and women's rights for some strange reason. But, we see the traditional and community leaders, religious actors are the largest group that are mentioned by the respondents when, we ask them to identify who's behind the threats. The second largest group are governments and authorities, usually in authoritarian countries. And actually on third place is other civil society organizations. 1 in 10 of the respondents said that they've been threatened or harassed by their peers. And this, in one way, I think it's a really horrific number and it's really upsetting. But on another way, you see a lot of this happens in really patriarchal societies. And I think it's so entrenched in all the systems and the structures in society. Naturally, right-wing and nationalist groups and politicians are also mentioned quite frequently. And then we have, the anti-gender movement, trolls on civil society, that's wrong, on social media. and there's other social media users. But what I also found really interesting that a lot of them talked about, the uncertainty of who is behind the threads and how that uncertainty adds a feeling of insecurity. And before the explosion of social media and online hatred, at least people knew who was behind the threats. Very often, at least they did. And today, there may be random social media users, or it could be organized troll campaigns, with boots that are just going, and it's not real people behind them. But it's not possible to identify individuals or groups. And one of the women human rights defenders from Armenia says in the study, I don't feel like I'm in danger, but I have a lingering sense of uncertainty, which is really causing a lot of stress as well.
Thank you so much for that, and for giving a presentation so that people know what we are talking about. I hope that everyone will read the report as well. Having said that, I will come back to you later about more what can be done, but I will move on now to Sofia Cal Thorpe. And I would like to know from you both a bit about your reactions to what you have heard and what you thought about when you saw the report, but also more maybe what Sweden could and should do to support the security for women human rights defenders. Sofia, over to you. And you need to unmute.
Yes, thank you, Eva, and thank you, Petra, and thanks to Kvinna for conducting this extremely important work. I think to have this overview and to sort of get the systematic outline of things that we of course know happen, but when you read out the numbers, Petra, it's quite a sort of shocking reality, of course, for women human rights defenders throughout the world that we can grasp through the report, and to put this together. By putting this together, I really think that Kvinna till Kvinna is contributing in an extremely important way to all of us who are looking into how we can support women human rights defenders in different ways. What are the main problems, and then how we as governments who are actively engaged can sort of try to address those. And I will just start by those of you who do not really know Sweden's policy that much. But Sweden was the first country in the world to proclaim a feminist foreign policy in 2014. And the reason for us the reason why we did this is, of course, very much what comes out in the report, that we see systematic discrimination, violence against women throughout the world. As for us, that's really one of the key challenges. If we want to address the global challenges, if we want to pursue our foreign policy goals, we really need to look at everything we do in terms of foreign policy through a gender lens and apply a feminist perspective throughout our foreign policy. So this is a concept that we launched in 2014, and since then we have really tried to work systematically to address, the rights of women, of course, is fundamental, but also the representation and the resources. Those 3 R's, as we call them, is very much the method through which we work. And I want just to highlight one thing that I thought was quite extremely interesting in the report that you pointed to, Petra, is the corruption that comes up now as the number one thing that spur hate and threat against women. And of course, I see very much a link to the issue of economic empowerment and the importance of looking into how we can also work with the third R in our feminist foreign policy, that is the resources, and to make sure that women are economically empowered in order to be able to stand up against corruption and hopefully as a means to address this issue. I think it comes out also in the report that, of course, it's issues linked to power structures and patriotic structures that I think are at the very root of the very difficult situation for women human rights defenders, and for the Swedish government to work throughout the spectra with the feminist foreign policy and looking at the rights, the representation, but also resources is, we think, quite an important way. But we also, of course, work a lot with women's human rights movements throughout the world. I think as a government, what we can do is, of course, to support all of you who are out on the front line in different ways, politically, by always letting women human rights defenders be heard, but also, of course, financial support is extremely important. We see that women's human rights organizations are often severely underfunded, and we have, through the global strategy for gender equality within our development cooperation, tried to work as much as possible with core support. We think it is important to give core support in order to make sure that organizations on the ground have the possibility to respond specifically to the needs they see. And I'm quite happy that we have managed to increase this support over the past years. And hopefully we will be able to do that also in the coming years. Just to highlight two specific programs that we support in terms of the security that you asked about, Eva, and how we can protect women human rights defenders throughout the world is our core support for the Global Fund for Women, which supports organizations worldwide. Another of our partner is Urgent Action Fund, which offers protection and support for women human rights and environmental defenders. We also see, of course, a clear link to the environmental defenders. I mean, we see the feminist movement and the environmental movement very much coming together in terms of challenging power structures throughout the world. So that is our support to the Urgent Action Fund, where we try to address both of those. And through this fund, activists can receive emergency grants to be flown out of the country, or to hire lawyers in order to take part in processes. And we do think that both those funds that we support are important ways to build the capacity of grassroots organizations to give them the possibility to protect themselves against threats. An issue that is tied into that is, of course, the issue of digital security, where again, core support gives the possibility for those organizations to address the threats that are the most acute in their specific situation. So we, as the Swedish government, look very much forward to work with Kvinna till Kvinna, but also with all of you in how we can strengthen our support. And we look forward to your recommendations and views, because we remain extremely committed, and look forward to a discussion on how we can join efforts in strengthening our support to women human rights defenders throughout the world. And again, thank you very much, Kvinna till Kvinna, for an excellent report.
And thank you so much, Sofia. And I'm sure we will all come back with a recommendation as well. And it's good to hear about the commitment from Sweden. I think it's needed in the world today. And maybe we will hear even more so when we go to Irena. And I wonder, this is not the easiest maybe to do, but I would like if you could give us a picture how it is to be a women human rights defenders in North Macedonia today. And then maybe specifically also looking at how does the anti-gender movement affect your work and your possibility to work? So Irena, maybe over to you.
Thank you, Eve, and thank you all. Yes, I'm Irena Cvitkovic from North Macedonia, coming from organization Coalition Margins, organization that works on human rights of marginalized groups with focus on gender and sexuality. And North Macedonia is an interesting case, but what we are now witnessing in North Macedonia and Europe is highly organized and well-funded transnational movement working on the domestic and international level to actually undermine women's rights, LGBTQI rights, and civil society participation in policy discussions and decisions. So their efforts aim at advancing actually an alternative understanding of the world order, one where the rights of certain groups, and you can imagine which groups, male, heterosexual, white, that precedence over others. So the anti-gender movement, I believe, must be analyzed within the context of general decline in freedom around the globe, and in particularly the shrinking space for civil society. And this is particularly pertinent when looking at the interconnectedness between the anti-gender movement and the far right. When it comes to their rhetorics, in North Macedonia, the language used by these movements is manipulative and even militaristic. They name all of us with whom they do not agree as totalitarians, inquisitors, liberal-fascists, revisionists, infiltrators, prostitutes, provocateurs, freaks, etc. And of course, in contrast, the movement presents themselves as modern, young, virtuous, and their adherents call themselves saviors, heroes, messiahs. So being target of this anti-gender movement means being constantly harassed, especially online. The last case I was that involved me was a few weeks ago, when there were pictures of me around social media with claims to liar and big with caps lock, Irena Cvetkovic is lying, and then followed by some screenshots, which I don't even want to get inside this debate, because did I use the word girls and women? And according to the anti-gender movement, we should not believe that women and girls exist. So the question that I'm dealing nowadays is, because this anti-gender movement really mobilized huge amount of people, is how and when did we become enemies of the people? And the second question is, what can we do to change this? And I have two possible answers to the first question. And one is, I always find answers for complicated questions within feminism. So the feminist critique on how gender mainstreaming is going and the professionalization of civil society highlights actually the fact that the institutionalization of certain feminist claims in the policy realm shifts gender equality away from the horizon of everyday experience and language of the common people, and presents it largely as a policy issue rather than a political one. And the second reason we might find within the neoliberal consensus and the neoliberal form of globalization, which is strengthening the right-wing populism. So having in mind that these actors actually demand and create societal polarization and division, I ask myself, how do we fight social polarization? And to be honest, I really believe feminists know best, with solidarity, with initiatives for reconciliation and fostering social cohesion. And women have proven their excellence in these areas. In our case, in North Macedonia, it took us few years to understand what is under attack. Not individuals, not Irena, not NGOs, coalition margins or others, but rather our worldviews, our ideologies, and our political agenda. So long story short, we established an informal network of like-minded people, and with support of Untitled and activists dedicated not to respond to this movement, but to create positive and supportive narratives, behaviors, and values connected to gender equality, sexual freedom, and reproductive rights in our context. Finally, working together in creating unique, authentic social base and political discourses with one aim, fighting all inequalities was, well, let's say, our weapon of choice.
Thank you so much, Irena. You both went through the bad and the good in 5 minutes. That's well done. And we'll get back to you a bit later, but I will turn now to your sister in arms, Hunada, and just ask what do you recognize from what Irena has talked about, but also for you being a feminist, working for a feminist organization, so you work with quite radical issues. How do you deal with that from a security point of view to make change happen?
Thank you very much, Eva. I would like to really thank Venna for organizing this, and thank you, Elena, for sharing your experience. And obviously, I would like to thank everyone here. I think I just would like to start that sometimes hearing such stories from a fellow sister or a defender, it sounds weird. It's not frustrating. It's actually quite empowering, because you're like, yeah, I know what you're talking about. And I think this is quite familiar for all of us. So to answer your questions, yes, I do recognize a lot of these issues that women human rights defenders are facing everywhere. And actually, a lot of them, I actually chose few from the report, just 3 examples to explain that these are 3 examples from the 3 different areas, and they all apply to us in a way or another. For example, one woman human rights defender from Bosnia and Herzegovina said many high-level corruption cases took place during COVID-19. There is still a total lack of women's organizations that work on corruption due to fear of government repercussions. Another woman human rights defender from a country in Central Africa said sexual and reproductive health and rights, abortion, and LGBTQI is way too sensitive. In some cases, also gender-based violence. In Latin America, smear campaigns and false accusations are the most common threat. And this is all too familiar. In one place, I told you I do not want anyone to be associated with what I say today, because I will explain to you in an example. And the report started actually with a sentence that really means so much to me, and I will explain why in a second. It starts with hatred against women human rights defender represents a serious threat against democracy, against gender equality, and against women's human rights. Now, to illustrate with a recent example, I apologize that I'm gonna read a quotation for you because it's not a nice quotation, but it is a quotation that really changed a lot in the lives of Syrian women human rights defenders. So it reads out the following. This is translation from Arabic. There are women, and I will explain after what is the context, what is this? But hear it and let me know what you think about it. There are women from our own blood. They came as recruits by the UN and others of centers of misinformation and infidelity. They come to spread amongst our daughters, particularly what they call the liberation of women, what they call gender and such names that they spread among our women, and saying, allow women their freedoms. And they tell our women that they are enslaved to the husbands and father. End of quote. So early in August this year, one very famous Islamic scholar in northern Syria decided to focus on his Friday prayer speech on organizations and persons working on women's rights and gender-related issues. Mind you, Friday speech is a place where locals gather, and this person is very famous. Like everyone in the North would say it. For him to select this topic and to select this targeted group has definitely meant what happened after, which was targeted campaigns against feminist human rights defenders. Now, if you think about it, for organizations and members doing it, just imagine that at one point you should stop using the word gender. And if you're a feminist and organization, even in Arabic, you can't use it. Now, women liberation, we can't use it. Why? Because if you use it, you're putting the person in the field at risk. Now, somewhere in the report it says we actually normalized this kind of campaigning, so we stopped seeing things as risks. Because I tell you now, yeah, of course I get cyberbullied all the time, but it's something we kind of get used to. We don't consider it because sisters are at a physical risk. So by prioritizing the physical risk, the cyberbullying becomes like, you know, we're used to it kind of, which is obviously not healthy. Now, usually the way we handle this situation is, first you should go back to particularly the women in the field, the frontline fighters, and we do ask them about what should be done. Now, in this case, they expressed great risks that should be addressed. We genuinely started, imagine or not, started thinking, how can you make a training about women's rights without saying women's rights? This is how far it went. Remove the word gender or the Arabic translation of it from every material. If needed, remove staff from their locations. It became such a sensitive topic. We know that at some point it will go down and we will handle it, but to be honest, that was something that really gave us a hard hit. Now, I have to say, despite all this, we do feel very strong, especially when the fight against us becomes so aggressive. If someone felt that they need to go on a Friday prayer speech and say this, that means our demands and efforts are leading for change. And it is very interesting, and this is why the title means so much to me, because we continue by our solidarity. Other Syrian defenders, women rights defenders, and I would always sit down and be laughing sometimes at how surprising and weird certain acts against us are. But we do know that this means change. It means change has happened, or is happening, or is gonna happen. That's our, yeah, no matter what they think that what they do is gonna do is often just making us more powerful. Now, so that's what actually leads us forward. Now, in a relevant note, what we also do, although we have been kind of, we became the scary feminists for the tables, we like it. So I know when I come into a meeting, and I know other fellow women would be coming in a meeting, they know that they will start telling us an excuse why, for example, there is no women there. They are accountable, not in front of me, in front of all the women are there. We have created a certain sense of accountability in these cases. We've also started asking for accountability about women in leadership position. And we are seeing a difference in it, and that we're seeing fear in the dominant leadership position. I just want to say at the end that we also need to always remember that in this case, intersectionality really matters. Women with disability, displaced women with no income, or women who did not get even an education, and others face even greater discrimination and exclusion. And this is on the top of our agenda. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Anada. And we will get back to you and hear even more what you think we could all do to support the work that you are doing. And we will turn to someone that is actually there to support a lot of human rights defenders. So I will turn to you, Ursula, now. And in the work that you and the Special Rapporteur for the situation of human rights defenders are doing, I wonder, first of all, if you recognize what has been said, but also what you see as the global trend, and then specifically for women human rights defenders. So Ursula, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Eva. Thanks for inviting me to this important discussion, and also thank you, Quina Tilquina, for the excellent report that we have read with great interest. And yes, I mean, to your question, I think the trends that you have analyzed and highlighted in the report converge to a large extent to what we have been seeing from the perspective of the UN and the Special Rapporteur in terms of how women human rights defenders are able to operate in the spaces that are available to them, and what are the threats and challenges that they are facing currently. So I see a lot of overlap and convergence, and especially encouraging in a way. I mean, of course, it's a sad encouragement, was the finding that one of the main threats your report found was related to the corruption cases for women activists who are working on anti-corruption issues. This is the topic of the upcoming report of the Special Rapporteur to the Human Rights Council. So it seems that we managed also to sort of tap on the issue that is topical right now. And of course, I mean, the other findings of the reports correspond very much to what we have been seeing. And as Petra said at the outset, that efforts to shrink civic space globally, including on freedom of expression, assembly, association, has affected all human rights defenders, of course, globally in all parts of the world. But what we have seen is that they have quite disproportionately impacted women human rights defenders who actually had very limited civic space to begin with. And with these trends, this has been shrinking further. As Sunada and others have mentioned, that what we think as well is that this shrinking and disproportionate shrinking and backlash might be due to the success of the movement, of the achievements that women's networks and women's movements and feminist movements have achieved, and this is creating this backlash. But regardless of the reasons for it, of course, it's a very serious concern for a Special Rapporteur on human rights defenders. The experiences of women human rights defenders and women in general, of course, are very diverse, and it's difficult to generalize, but there are some trends and issues that are emerging as converging issues that we have been witnessing. One of them, and I think it has come up also in the previous panelist interventions, was that often women are not only targeted as individuals, but they are targeted because they belong to certain networks, collectives, or movements. And the attacks against them are means to serve as warnings for others, and they have severe ripple effects often on civic participation, on women's civic participation and leadership, and may lead to a very serious self-censorship in certain contexts, of course. Now, in terms of highlighting some of the threats that we have been observing with the Special Rapporteur, the first that I would like to mention is the non-recognition and marginalization and systemic exclusion of women human rights defenders. Women activists are often rendered invisible, their contributions are marginalized, they are ignored, belittled, often relegated into support roles within their organizations or their networks. And as Sofia mentioned, sometimes women's organizations are quite severely underfunded as well, especially for the core activities. The second trend that we have seen as well, and you have mentioned, several of you mentioned, is the public shaming, stigmatization, the attacks on the honor of women and their reputation. This is, of course, a powerful way. So the easiest means to attack women human rights defenders is to damage their honor or reputation, which then may lead to stigmatization and quite serious isolation in certain contexts. In particular in conservative societies, but of course everywhere in the world, women human rights defenders are derided for their efforts to create change, and they are labeled under several labels, being bad mothers, they are nasty, they are witches, separatists, traitors, and other harmful anti-gender narratives are used in terms of in the framework of quite serious campaigns against them. This stigmatization and ostracism comes from community leaders, faith-based groups, anti-gender groups that we've mentioned, but often from their own families and communities, and sometimes also from within the women's movement. I mean, depending on the subject issues that the defenders are working on. Lately, what we have seen is that, for instance, women human rights defenders working on sex workers and LGBTI issues have been experiencing some ostracism from within the human rights defenders. A third trend that we are seeing is that these threats and risks and attacks are increasingly happening in the private sphere of women activists, and they are targeting not just the defenders themselves, but their loved ones, their families, those around them, often even those that write about them. And the children are also used in these kind of campaigns and threats. Physical threats and threats of violence, of course, is very serious all over the world, and it's often used to silence women defenders. And as some of you have mentioned, and the report also highlights, is that even the rumors of sexual violence can be very damaging. It might not even happen, but if the rumors start circulating, that it itself it has a very damaging effect on women human rights defenders. But I mean, beyond the threats of violence and the rumors, of course, there are very serious cases of rape, acid attacks, arbitrary arrests, femicide, and enforced disappearances. The online aspect of these attacks and violence is very significant. I mean, it was on the rise before the COVID-19 pandemic, but with the lockdowns and the restrictions on movement, on gatherings, and participation in general, we have seen an increase in this regard. And quite serious underreporting from the side of women human rights defenders who, as you said as well, take these threats or regard these threats as normal part of their everyday work, and they don't necessarily go to the police to report. And even if they do go and report, this is not taken seriously by the law enforcement officials. Apart from this, of course, there is also judicial harassment and criminalization in many parts of the world, including the use of blasphemy laws and public morality laws, strategic lawsuits, including slaps and false accusations against defenders. And there is also, in some cases, forced treatments, physical incarceration, forced psychiatric treatments, and detention in immigration centers. These are just some of the trends that we have been seeing. But circling back a little bit to the death threats and the killings of women human rights defenders, one of the observations, I think, that was very clear when the rapporteur was gathering information for the report on the killings of human rights defenders was that killings and physical attacks are almost always preceded by credible threats. And then this is where we get back to the threats that become normalized, and women defenders are not reporting on them. That the important point is to sort of act both for defenders themselves and for the governments that are ultimately responsible for the protection of human rights defenders, is to act at the point where the threats are occurring, and to take these threats seriously, to investigate and prosecute them. Of course, some women human rights defenders do not want to report on the death threats because they are highly defamatory in nature and involve their personal lives, marital status, lifestyle, and religious beliefs. And because of the underreporting, or then they're not prosecuting an investigation, there is serious impunity, which again perpetrates the whole cycle and normalizes these threats and gets also often underreported in media. So yeah, basically this is in a nutshell what we have been seeing in the cases that have reached the rapporteur. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula. And it might feel like we are talking about things that are depressing, and it is in many ways, but it is also needed to talk about to actually make change happen. We don't have much time, and I would like to ask you all at least one more question, and I will ask you all to be really brief in answering it, because we have 15 minutes to go before it all ends. And I want to start with Sofia. I was thinking, we've heard anti-gender movement being mentioned many times, and I wonder what could Sweden do, because this is also a trend that is big in the EU, but also that is big, well, it's on the rise in Sweden as well. So what can Sweden do to actually combat the anti-gender trend that is going on now?
Thank you, Eva, and thanks to everyone sharing their experiences. I think part of the answer, or an important part of the answer, is of course the title of your report, Solidarity, It's Our Only Weapon. And I think that what we can do and what we do is to really show solidarity and to work with those organizations on the ground facing extremely difficult situations. Also facing the anti-gen movement very concretely, as we have heard from Hunada and others. But as you say, I mean, the movement, the anti-gender movement, is also getting strong in Europe and in Sweden, and we work extremely hard. Sweden will be chairing the European Union in 2023, and gender equality will be one of our absolute top priorities. We see a very alarming situation in some member states, with those movements growing very strong. So what we need to do is that we need to, put this issue at the top of our agenda. We need to remain extremely clear on that gender equality is not it's for us very much a prerequisite if we want to develop our societies and move forward. We do need to have a feminist perspective to everything we do. So we need to stand extremely strong and vocal on this, but then of course be work in solidarity with other countries and other partners organizations. But I listened, Hunada, to with the quote that you mentioned from this northern Syria. It was so starking, because obviously if you cannot even talk about women's rights, how can we then? It sounds also from what you said that getting support from countries like Sweden might in itself put you at danger. So I think that is also something that is that was quite starking to me somewhat, and we really need to see how we can work together on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sofia. And I think there is always ways to come around so that you can still support, because it's all a matter of the request of visibility of the donor, I think, as well. That sometimes needs to be a bit less. So, but I was going to ask Irena first. Okay, so now let's hope there are a lot of people here with a lot of power and money that are listening in. Some are on the panel. Say one thing that you really think that they could help you with to support you in your work right now. That very easy question, Irena.
Yeah, very easy. Yeah, I think what is one thing that it is actually joint action between people with power to support us and us who are human rights defenders on the ground is shifting the focus from policy advocacy, working with governments, institutions, into working with people, or at least balancing the work. I think one of the things that is happening, this professionalization of civil society, is because the civil society is becoming more and more as an industry, as a market, rather than what it used to be 10 years ago, for example, or 20, or I don't know. So one thing that I think it is a challenge for both sides is working in changing people's hearts and minds. And I think the establishments and the people with power will more easily follow than our agendas.
Thank you so much. So it's joint action, not for us, but with us, or even following us. Yeah. And Hunada, and now as so many have mentioned the name of the report, Hunada is the one that we are quoting from the interview with Hunada. So she is the inspiration behind the name of the report. So solidarity, how can it be strengthened? What do you want to ask for?
Well, honestly speaking, I started, and I really, really mean it. The strongest that I felt this year and the previous years was when different movements came together. It wasn't only women movement. It was us, LGBT, sexuality rights, disability rights. It felt so strong. And the thing is, once we are so many, we're just too many to be ignored. They cannot ignore our voices. And despite everything, I think that what we could do is that bring this solidarity of different movements together, and then, sorry, my mates on the tables, we want to by force to take our seats. Like, it's enough with, we kindly ask you to have a quota. I don't kindly ask you to have a quota. We're too many. We want to be on the table. Thank you for moving off the table and let us sit down. So I think once we are so many, they cannot just ignore us.
Thank you. That's a good suggestion. My favorite quote is, oh God, what's her name? Shirley Chisholm, Afro-American woman who was into politics. She was a member of the Senate, and she said, if you're not invited, if they don't bring you to the table, bring a folding chair. So not to accept, not to be there. And Ursula, what could you do, and you are already doing, but what could you do to reach out to more women human rights defenders so they know what you can do for them?
Yeah, actually, I mean, it's a good question. Of course, we are doing it, and not just the special rapporteur herself, but the UN as a whole, and especially OHCHR colleagues on the ground. They are reaching out to women human rights defenders. They're trying to raise awareness about the different mechanisms that exist for their protection, for the reporting of the threats. You know, it's not just to special procedures, but to other mechanisms as well. And I think there is an increased awareness about this, and we are obviously trying to continue reaching out directly and through networks and movements. And I think this ties back to what Hunad and others have said about the need to be working instead of the silos, but sort of in a more interconnected way across the different topics and movements. And one of the key shifts that OHCHR has started working on and is trying to push in every field presence that we are at is the building of networks for human rights defenders in a broad way. So not just thematic networks, meaning, you know, women's rights issues, but broader networks for defenders on the ground, exactly for the reasons that have been mentioned, to showcase that the experiences that have been highlighted by the report and here as well are not isolated experiences, but have been going around and experienced by others as well. But also, as Sunada said, you know, there is power in the numbers, that if more are joined up, then the action can be more successful. And of course, I mean, I would encourage, and we do this all the time, to keep reporting. Send your cases to the special rapporteur, please, because unless we receive a submission, the rapporteur cannot act on cases, and if there is no action on cases, then there is underreporting, then the trends are not coming out. The reporting is really, really simple, and I really want to stress that it doesn't need to be a judicial sort of submission. It's a small summary, but please do send it to us, and then we'll try to do our best to release it with the governments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ursula. And the rapporteur herself, Mary Lawler, she's quite active on social media, including Facebook, and are writing about different cases. So even if you can't do things in one way, I think she finds ways to do it another way. Okay, the final minutes are here. But before ending it, Petra, I want to turn to you. And from your perspective, or our perspective, what is needed to be done right now the most, do you think?
Well, I think so many brilliant things have been said. And I think the recognition that women human rights defenders are in an extra exposed situation, you know, for all of the reasons that you have been mentioning, everything from patriarchy to anti-gender movements, to threats coming from in civil society, but also what does it mean to challenge norms and structures in your everyday life? So acknowledge that. And then we know, we've talked about it, it is about funding women's movement. And I think it was really interesting what you said, Irina, about this. How does civil society, has women's rights movement become, you know, dispatched from ordinary people, whatever ordinary people are, and in the dialogue and in the conversation? And what does it mean then for the women's movement standing in between donors that have really high demands of a professionalization, a word I obviously couldn't say today, but being able to, you know, to write funding proposal and to write reports. And it is a profession, you know, it is skill and it's an expertise that is needed for that, but still standing doing this balance. And I think this is a conversation that we as Kvinna till Kvinna, being part of the international women's movement, and, you know, but also having a lot of close dialogue with decision makers and with institutional funders, really need to focus on moving forward in finding this balance. But I don't think there's any doubt at all that more funding needs to go to women's movement, because research shows, experience shows the important development that comes from that. But really, thank you so much, Hunada, Irina, for the work that you do every day. And, you know, you're amazing and your colleagues are amazing. And let's continue to find these alliances so we can work in solidarity and push back on the shrinking space and the pushback on gender equality. And thank you, Eva, for really being part of writing this report, but also moderating this session here today.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Petra, Ursula, Sofia, Irina, Hunada, all of you for contributing and giving your time and keeping time so that actually everybody got to speak. Not the easiest thing. I think it's very clear that this is a topic that we will come back to many times. I think we need to think about how solidarity is built and how we can create the safe spaces and meeting that will give more strength and courage and inspiration for everyone who is working for everyone's human rights every day. Thank you, everyone who have listened in. We managed to finish on time, and I hope and wish you all a warmer place than we are sitting in right now. It's really cold in Sweden. Thank you and goodbye.